Okay, Paternoster Gang Big Finish series, I've gone out on a limb for you during this recent Trespassers arc for the past year and a half. The least you can do now, in the last box set Last Stand, is not drop the ball. Okay? I'm serious. I've really liked this range, and I really want this to work out. Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mr. TARDIS, and doing these Big Finish reviews, for me, the big breakout surprise range from Big Finish Productions has been the Paternoster Gang series. Created by Steven Moffat nearly 15 years ago, they've not been seen on screen since 2014, but the cast are back for audio adventures, they've had a new lease of life on Big Finish, and their recent arc, subtitled Trespassers, started in late 2023 and has now come to a conclusion in early 2025. This release came out in March, this review's coming out in July. I know I'm behind, I'm sorry. And this range is set in Victorian London. It stars Neve McIntosh as Vastra the Silurian, Catherine Stewart as Jenny, and Dan Starkey as Drax the Sontaran. This new run, Trespassers, started with Jenny and Vastra finally tying the knot. However, Jenny was not what she appeared to be. It turns out that Paternoster Row had been infiltrated by a Zygon, and this Zygon, named Brotac, played by Nicholas Briggs, also has a massive criminal underworld in Victorian London. So it's up to the Paternoster Gang to figure out who they can trust and bring Brotac down. Culminating in this fourth box set, the Paternoster Gang Trespassers 4 Last Stand. We've got a trilogy of stories. We've got I Married a Zygon by Alan Ronald, A Passion for Fashion by Helen Goldwyn, and The Final Problem by Lauren Mooney and Stuart Pringle. So I Married a Zygon takes place shortly after the events of Trespassers 3 No Place Like Home, where Brotac's disguise had been rumbled, but Brotac managed to escape. And Vastra, as the great detective, is on the hunt, and they get a lead with Miss Faversham, who you may remember from the first box set, who is betrothed to Paul McGann's 8th Doctor, who is also in this box set as well, but not in this story. Miss Faversham, played by Beth Chalmers, apparently has tied the knot again to an older, unassuming gentleman, Lord Briar, played by Nicholas Briggs. After everything that happened with Miss Faversham last time, the Paternoster Gang are thinking there's no way she'd want to get married after an experience like that, so clearly something's up here, we're going to go investigate. However, they're not the only people investigating Miss Faversham's home. You also have Harriet Cross, played by Lara Lemon, who is a poltergeist hunter and is using rudimentary technology from the Victorian era to try and suss out some sort of spectre in the home. And in what essentially amounts to a Scooby-Doo mystery, the gang split up and try and figure out what's going on in the home and if Lord Briar is who he claims to be.
Now this is a bedroom. Huge fireplace and everything.
To keep your voices down.
Miss Faversham, can you hear me?
She looks so weak, as opposed to her usual abrasive self.
Strax.
What in the blazes is that?
A medical scanner.
I'd rather you didn't if it's all the same.
Continue, Strax.
Now listen here.
The scanner's detected rapid cellular apoptosis, likely natural.
What does that mean?
She will soon be dead.
Dead?
Remember what we said about bedside manners, Strax?
Quite right, lad. I regret to inform you, she will soon be dead.
This is awful.
Nonsense. Fresh air, good food and rest is all she needs. You're a nurse, not a doctor.
Doctor! Where? Oh, rip his eyes out!
Vastra? I'm hallucinating. Dresden, fetch the leeches. I fear I am due a sapping.
It's all right. Vastra and her associates have come to visit you.
I Married a Zygon opens with a scene where Strax orders a fish and chips and then punches the waiter, so it starts on a really strong note. And when the A-plot gets moving, you essentially have 3 narrative strands. You've got Vastra with Lord Briar trying to interrogate him and try and figure out what his deal is, whether or not he actually has Miss Faversham's best interest at heart, or whether he's just marrying her for her money or something, or manipulating her, maybe poisoning her, because Miss Faversham is also very sick. You have Jenny teaming up with Harriet, the poltergeist hunter, and they do some investigating on their own, and the most entertaining pairing is with Strax and Mr. Randolph, the butler, played by Shogo Miyakita, and he is absolutely hilarious as this ex-military guy who basically matches Strax's freak, and the two develop this really fun antagonistic rivalry where they just beat the crap out of each other for half of the runtime, and it's really entertaining. While Strax has the most entertaining subplot, Vastra has the one with the most dramatic heft, because Vastra, after the events of everything that's been going on over the past few box sets, she is incredibly paranoid and she's starting to suspect everybody of being a Zygon, and she has her guard permanently up, and it's essentially affecting her judgment. Because Lord Briar, he just seems like a normal, unassuming guy. He just so happens to be played by the same voice actor, Nicholas Briggs, who also voices the Zygons. How's that for a coincidence? And there's a few really engaging standout scenes when Vastra is playing a card game with Lord Briar to try and suss him out. But what prevents I Married a Zygon from really reaching its peak is that because you have these three narrative strands, it kind of feels like we're getting 3 1/3 measures. Don't get me wrong, splitting up the cast is effective in giving this story a great pace and structure to it, but in terms of the actual substance of the material, actually fleshing out the characters, we only kind of get allusions to that. There's only really like the hint of a poltergeist story. There's a couple of lip service scenes to an investigation that really, as far as I'm concerned, didn't really amount to much in regards to the main Miss Faversham A-plot. And because you've got these three pairings, these three subplots fighting for space in this story, it means that none of them feel as fully fleshed out as they probably should be. And if I had to choose which one needed more focus, it would be the Vastra one, because that's the most dramatically impactful one. And Neve McIntosh plays with the material really well. She really leans into the subtext of her space, her environment, her family and friends just being violated in some way by this Zygon infiltration, by this trespasser. Oh, he said it. But because you've split the characters up and there's not really a lot of Brotac Zygon stuff until like the third act of the episode, it means that you're not really building upon that subtext really effectively, which I think is a bit of a shame, but it's still an entertaining story, and Beth Chalmers is a lot of fun as Miss Faversham, just really letting loose. You think she was fun and hysterical in the first box set? You ain't seen nothing yet when it comes to Miss Faversham, let me tell you that. Now the next story, which need I remind you is the penultimate story in this Trespassers story arc, A Passion for Fashion, actually has nothing to do with Brotac. It has nothing to do with the Zygon infiltration, which is an interesting choice, but thankfully it is telling a really interesting story. The story opens with this woman, Miss Trelawney, arriving on Paternoster Row and dying, and she is just the latest in many women from high society who are growing incredibly sick after purchasing hats and fashion accessories from the new enigmatic fashion designer that's hit London, Monsieur de Klerk, played by Cammy Darwish. The Paternoster gang go to the newly opened Henrik's department store in order to investigate further, and they enlist the help of a talented saleswoman, Ethel Kipling, played by Susan Harrison. And with Ethel's help, the Paternoster gang stumble across a big criminal conspiracy, revealing that Monsieur de Klerk is way more than just a flamboyant fashionista.
What type of feathers are these?
Some believe they are from the exotic ostrich of North Africa. This excess of feathers is Monsieur de Klerk's signature style. A little overdone, if you ask me, but a new designer in town always causes a stir until the next one takes his place. Look how these feathers shimmer.
All that infernal dangling would obscure one's visor. Potentially fatal.
Perhaps the young lady would like to try this piece on?
Thank you, but Jenny has a strong aversion to anything other than her boater.
Don't mind if I do, actually.
Really?
Why not? Something new.
That's it. And then tip it just so.
Have you a looking glass?
Behind you, miss.
Well, don't I look like a bit of jam?
Well, it's certainly different. Do you really like it, my dear?
I love it.
Then we'll take it. It's rare that you fall in love.
But when I do, it's with all my heart.
Shall I take it to the till?
Please do, and thank you, Miss...
Kipling, ma'am. Ethel Kipling.
I am Madame Vastra. This is my maidservant and wife, Jenny. And this is my valet, Strax.
A Passion for Fashion is a really interesting story, and it was really fascinating listening to writer Helen Goldwyn talk about the inspiration for the story. The episode was based on the life of Emily Williamson, who was instrumental in changing the plumage trade during Victorian England, because the relatively new fashion trade was decimating the population of imported birds. And in pursuit of that, Emily became a co-founder of the Society for the Protection of Birds. And that's a really interesting story, and the way it manifests over the course of A Passion for Fashion I found to be a pretty enthralling narrative conspiracy about high society fashion, and also you've got these alien feathers for the plumage of these hats which wind up corrupting and making ill the people who wear them, including, unfortunately for our Paternoster gang, Jenny. And it's also nice to throw in that extra bit of conflict between Jenny and Vastra, where Jenny is starting to become obsessed with the plumes of this hat and this new high society fashion that really she's kind of trying to adopt, and how Vastra tries to kindly navigate that situation I thought was really interesting to listen to. If there is one thing that kind of raised an eyebrow with me for this story, it's that the twist, which I won't give away, but the twist in I Married a Zygon and A Passion for Fashion is essentially the same, which is a shame because these are two back-to-back stories, so having essentially the same twist in the third act was, I don't know, I thought that was a little bit disappointing. However, the cast are great. You've got Cammy Darwish as Monsieur de Klerk, who you may remember in Doctor Who Flux, in Survivors of the Flux. He plays the hermit at the top of the mountain, the one who's like, I'm teasing you! And hearing him talk about that in the behind-the-scenes interviews was really fun and entertaining. But also, massive shout-out to Susan Harrison, who you think in this box set plays these three roles. No, these are all in the same story. Ethel Kipling, Miss Trelawney, and Lady Livingston, these are all in the same story. And she's terrific at multi-rolling. And in the behind-the-scenes interview, Dan Starkey talks about how he's worked with Susan Harrison in their comedy improv career, but also in the CBBC comedy series Class Dismissed. And in Class Dismissed, the adult actors are multi-rolling all of the faculty members of this school. And Dan Starkey mentions that Susan plays the mob boss librarian, and then I remembered how I know Susan Harrison. So I worked on series 3 of Class Dismissed with Dan Starkey and Susan Harrison. It was one of my first TV credits when I was just starting out. There's my name on the bottom right there as one of the production runners. But not only that, I've acted on screen with Susan Harrison. I am the mafioso bodyguard who stands behind her in these scenes. This is me. 8 years ago and about 20 kilos heavier.
Yeah. Ron. No, you! Now pay attention.
Yeah, I'm Ron the bodyguard, and to make me even taller behind Susan, I'm stood on a box. So yeah, there's my conflict of interest. I completely forgot that I did that until Dan Starkey was talking in the interviews about him and Susan in Class Dismissed. God, when did I film that? 2016? 2017? God. What is time? Time is a lake. Time is a flat circle. But yeah, A Passion for Fashion was a strong standalone story in this Trespassers arc, but it's like, you are one episode away now from the finale of this 12-episode arc, and it has nothing to do with Brotac. It's an interesting strategy. But it does end on a nice note. It does end on a nice mission statement for the Paternoster gang setting of Victorian London as well. That not every alien that they encounter is going to be hostile. Some of them genuinely need help, and that's a nice mission statement for this. It's kind of like the Sarah Jane Adventures, where they would emphasize that not every alien that visits Earth is there for an invasion. And the last story of this box set, and the last story of the Trespassers arc, is The Final Problem by Lauren Mooney and Stuart Pringle, both of these writers whom I love. It's been several months since the gang have seen Brotac, and one day there's a knock on the door. It's the bailiffs, and the bailiffs use some legal loophole to kick the Paternoster gang out of their home, and Brotac, in disguise as the 8th Doctor, played by Paul McGann, seizes the property, and effectively takes Paternoster Row as his own. The Paternoster gang move in with Mrs. Macready, played by Kate O'Sullivan, who runs this seedy, cheap boarding house in London. However, the gang find their belongings being stolen and just disappearing, seemingly into thin air, and Strax thinks that they have a problem. AKA, he thinks that there's some creature called a problem that the Sontarans fought centuries ago that is basically able to steal not just things but also concepts. Because in London, there's no longer a Thursday, and Strax thinks that the problems have eaten the concept of Thursdays. So Vastra's on the case trying to get Paternoster Row back. Strax and Jenny need to stop this problem, all the while Brotac is being played by the brilliant Paul McGann.
If we take the house by force, we risk alerting the authorities.
So?
Well, we cannot risk scandal, exposure, incarceration. The century is not a friend to the, unusual.
Quite right, too.
The Doctor!
Of course it's not Strax. That skin don't belong to you, Brotac.
Oh, but it fits me so well. It was my first on this world.
Or perhaps you are so drained it is all that is left to you.
In any case, it's just the ticket for buttering up a few officers of the law.
What is he on about?
What officers of the law?
I finished digging into the provenance of the house you've been squatting. My house. Here it is, in black and white.
What is this subterfuge?
It's a deed.
It's a forgery.
Wrong again, gutter snipe.
Let me see. As I feared, a genuine document confirming original ownership of the house predating our residence.
So, Madame Vastra, would you mind clearing your detritus from the road? It's so unsightly.
I'm in two minds when it comes to the final problem. It's a fine story on its own, but as a finale, I don't really think it works as well as it should. The main issue here is that while Paul McGann is a great get for Brotack, they haven't done nearly enough legwork to make Brotack an interesting villain. He really is, in this story, carried by Paul McGann's performance, where he is just really leaning into the insidious villainy, and he does really well there. But as you can tell from the title, The Final Problem, it's trying to draw comparisons to Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty's, with The Final Problem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So Vastra's the great detective, she's the Sherlock Holmes, and Brotack is meant to be the Moriarty, but Brotack has not even remotely been that interesting or compelling or effective a villain. We're told that he has this underground network in London, but we hardly really see much of it. He hardly utilizes it. He's only really been present as a character in the past 2 box sets, and he's only made a handful of appearances. And part of me even thinks that the story knows that Brotack is a lackluster villain because it has to introduce the problems in order to make it a more interesting hour-long adventure. If the final problem had been like a mid-chapter in this rivalry between Vastra and Brotack, great. But as a finale, as like the big Reichenbach fall moment for Vastra, I'm sorry, but the legwork just hasn't been done there. Brotack is just not an interesting villain. He's just not an interesting character. The fact that he's a Zygon is kind of the most intimidating part about him, not his intellect, not his network, not his character or his personality, which is why I think maybe A Passion for Fashion could have included Brotack, like in any capacity, to sort of build up this rivalry. Understandably, Vastra finds this to be a very personal infiltration of her life. She thought that she was marrying Jenny and it turned out to be Brotack, but we haven't really dealt with that properly. I think the scenes with Paul McGann are great, but Paul McGann as a performer is what's carrying those scenes, not him playing a really enthralling character. While Vastra disappears for a big chunk of the episode, I think it's great for Jenny and Strax to get more time together as they try and figure out a way to get Paternoster Row back, but it ends up culminating in a pretty confusing finale that I thought was leading into a cliffhanger for a new range of box sets, but then they seem to resolve the cliffhanger in a mid-credit scene, and I think that's what's happened. The ending of this story actually left me pretty confused. I don't know, it's a little bit disappointing that after 12 episodes, after a year and a half worth of stories with the Paternoster Gang, the final problem does kind of drop the ball when it comes to the Brotack and Zygon subplot, like the overarching theme of these 12 episodes, of these 4 box sets. Thankfully, the Paternoster Gang at Trespassers Range manages to stay standing and stands effectively because the character work is so strong. The performances across the board from all of the actors are really terrific, including our guest doctors, Paul McGann, Michael Troughton, Tom Baker, all doing terrific work. And the standalone stories, the standalone adventures are really great, but the overarching Zygon infiltration of Paternoster Row, because it hasn't really been present enough, because Brotack as a character hasn't been active or hasn't been around enough to establish himself as a character, establish himself as a rival to Vastra the Great Detective, it does mean that unfortunately the actual main hook of the story kind of falls flat in the end. But I will say, and this is not me caving to a sunk cost fallacy, okay? I would still really recommend this range because the comedy is so strong, particularly No Place Like Home, which I will say, having listened to all of these Trespasser box sets, is the peak of this range, and the characters and the world building of Victorian London are really effectively done. If you want to take a gamble on a less visible and more niche Big Finish range, I would say roll that dice with the Paternoster Gang, because I've had a really good time with these box sets. I just wish that they'd done more with Brotack. That's really the missing element here. I do hope that they do more Paternoster Gang stories. I just hope that they pick a lane between either doing just really great inventive standalone stories or really commit to an ongoing arc and really flesh out the characters in that arc. Because with Trespassers, a really entertaining series, I think that they couldn't really make up their mind on what they wanted to do. That's why the penultimate chapter here, A Passion for Fashion, feels so out of place. Even though, on its own, it is a really entertaining story, and I actually think is the best story in this box set. Thank you so much for watching my review of the Paternoster Gang Trespassers Last Stand. Let me know what you've thought of the Paternoster Gang range in the comment section below. If you're willing to pick up this series, let me know in the comment section. Hit the like button, subscribe for more Doctor Who Big Finish reviews, and folks, I'll see you all next time.